What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sitdown. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think in the comment section below. Also, if you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, you're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sitdown video. If this video today gets to 1,000 likes, I will pick one lucky commenter and they will win a cash prize. The more you like it and the more you comment, the better you have a chance to win. Now, again, please don't fill the comment section with 7,000 comments from yourself personally, but just comment. I'm sure I'll notice. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get in to another very interesting organized crime topic. And we've seen them all. Sam Gravano, John A. Light, Gene Borello, Frank Pasqua, all individuals that were connected to the Mafia that at one point decided to cooperate. Today, we're going to talk about another individual that decided to cooperate, a man that grew up and ultimately became a member of the Genovese Crime Family. He was around a lot of very powerful people, including Tony Salerno. The story of Vincent the Fish Cafaro next on Sitdown Shorts. Vincent Cafaro was born August 27th, 1933 in Gambugliano in Italy. Gambugliano is just outside of Vicenza, obviously in the north of Italy. You can see by that blue dot, it's not far from Venice. Now, in his childhood, it was alleged that Cafaro's family would emigrate to the United States and settle in East Harlem. Now, I want to give a little picture as to what Harlem was in the 20s. It was alleged that in the 20s, over 100,000 Italians lived in East Harlem. It truly was one of the largest Italian populations in America. And it was also talked about that the first Italians would actually come over from Italy in 1878. And a lot of them came from the south of Italy. But by the early 1900s, Southern Italians, Sicilians, and even Northern Italians into the 20s started to emigrate to Harlem. Now, today, Harlem is more of a melting pot, and all sorts of different cultures have descended upon Harlem. It is a borough, though, that we don't talk about being in Manhattan. It's part of that Manhattan borough, but it really is a borough of itself almost. Harlem is a very interesting place. And as I said, in the 1900s, it was littered with Italians. Now, for Vincent Cafaro, his life with the police would get started very quickly. In his late teens, he would be arrested for possessing narcotics. At that point, it was talked about that in those days, generally, if you had a problem with your kid, your grandkid, you would go to the local mobsters to try to knock some sense into them, if you will. You know, if we've all seen, for instance, like Maury Povich, where years ago, if you had a kid who was doing stupid stuff, you take him to Maury and the drill instructor screams at him. In a weird way, it seemed like back then, you old Italian grandparents and parents would take their kids to gangsters. And it was talked about by Vincent Cafaro that basically at the age of 17, his grandparents would go to a very young Tony Salerno, who by this point was a soldier in the Genovese crime family, and asked him for guidance. He would allegedly tell a young Vincent Cafaro that, you know, essentially he should stay away from the drug trade, and if that he needed money to go out and steal things. That was the easiest way to create a dollar for himself. But I think what he realized was he saw something in young Vincent Cafaro, and Salerno would basically take him under his wing. And by the late 50s, Salerno would ask Vincent Cafaro to work out of a numbers bank that he had created. Now, it is important to understand that by the early 60s, Tony Salerno was the king of numbers, particularly in Harlem and really in Manhattan and New York in general. Tony Salerno, in my estimation, is the biggest earner in the history of the Mafia. In fact, during the 60s, his numbers business alone was bringing in $50 to $75 million a year. Now, think about that. That is in the early 60s. That doesn't even count the fact that he was in all these other rackets as well. And Tony Salerno would adopt something called a 2-block rule, and that no one could operate in and around any numbers office that he would have. Now, he would also have, Salerno, a rule that essentially it didn't matter who you were. And if you were Jewish or Spanish, you basically kicked up to him. He owned the numbers racket. And whether it was a guy like Spanish Raymond Marquez or Jewish numbers runners, they were kicking up to Tony Salerno. And Vinny the Fish got a real schooling in not only the numbers rackets, but gambling rackets as well, which we'll get to in just a little bit. Now, Cafaro would also claim that at one point in the late 50s, mob informant Joe Valachi at one point tried to shake him down for pieces of his numbers business. And he essentially told Cargo Valachi that he was with Tony Salerno, and it kind of just ended there. But as we know, Joe Valachi was our first real look into the Mafia as he decided to cooperate in the 60s. Now, I do want to talk about eventually when Vinny the Fish Cafaro would be made. And I do want to say this because it seems like I have to explain everything if I mention a date. I am well aware that the books were closed until the mid-70s. Now, I dealt with two different sources on this, one of which came directly from Vincent Cafaro, and the other one was a terrific website that's very good with mob ceremonies called LCN Blogspot. They would say that Vincent the Fish Cafaro was made in 1976. Now, Cafaro would say that he would be made in 74. Now, that would go against the fact that in 1974, the books were essentially closed. Now, not only would Cafaro say this, but another informant called George Barone would also say he was made in 1974. And as I've heard many creators talk about, this is always a point of contention. I know Michael Franzese has discussed he was made in 1975. We can make it clear that there was a possibility that whether it was the Colombo family or the Genovese family, particularly the Genovese family, maybe they just did what they wanted. That's entirely possible. They generally seem to march to the beat of their own drums in certain decisions. Now, it is important to say that whether it was 1974 or 1976, Vincent Cafaro would talk about the night that he was made. He would say that at one point he would be picked up and taken to Il Cortile Ristorante Italiano, which, interestingly enough, is actually still around. It is at 125 Mulberry Street in Little Italy. And I will say, I do know people that have been to Il Cortile. I have not been there myself, but many people will say that still today it is a terrific restaurant. And as we know, Il Cortile is in Giganti territory down in Little Italy, Greenwich Village area. He would say, Cafaro, that he would walk into the restaurant, into the back, and that Salerno and Frank Funzi Thierry would be waiting for him. He would say that in that initiation, and according to lcmblogspot.com, he would say, quote, Funzi then showed me the gun and the knife. He would say, this is the gun and the knife. You live with the gun and you die by the knife. He told me that Tony Salerno had sponsored me and gave me a piece of paper to let burn in my hand while I took the oath. Funzi Thierry would also say, quote, if you betray the Cosa Nostra, I shall burn like that piece of paper. Cafaro would then say that a knife was then picked up and basically his finger was pricked, and that Funzi Thierry would say, quote, now you are amico nostra. You have been born over again. You're a man. You belong to us. From this point on, you're amico nostra, a soldier in the Genovese family. Thierry would also say that they're the most powerful brigade or borgata in New York City, and for that matter, in the United States. He would also, Cafaro would say that he was told about certain rules that members of Amico Nostra had to live by. Now, obviously, Amico Nostra basically means friends of ours. And the rules were, quote, no fooling around with another man's wife, a made man's wife, no junk, which no drug dealing, as well as no dealing with pornography or government bonds, and, quote, never talking about this thing to anyone but Amico Nostra. So that was an interesting point. No pornography, which, as we know, the mob was very involved with in the 70s. It is talked about that In certain families, though, they did not operate with not only pornography but drugs as well. We all know they were still going on, but still, it is interesting that Cafaro was told that it is initiation. So by the late 70s, he is a made man. It wouldn't matter, though. He was making a ton of money by this point. He was involved with, as I said, the numbers racket. Now, what the mob was doing by this point is, as we know, the New York lottery would be created, and eventually that would become to seep into the business. But what the Genovese crime family did is they would offer better payouts. So these people of Harlem and other areas were in essence, wanted to deal with the mob because they could get a 6-to-1 payout as opposed to a 5-to-1 payout. The mob just basically fixed things and made it more easy to work with them as opposed to New York State Lottery. Now, obviously, with some of the lottery stuff, Vincent Cafaro would say that he would become a very rich man by this point. By the late 70s, he was saying he'd be making an upwards of $80,000 a day, and that he was making millions of dollars even after kicking up to Tony Salerno. Now, during the day-to-day operations in the early 70s and into the 80s, we can see Vincent Cafaro is very much in constant contact with Tony Salerno, hanging out at Salerno's social club in East Harlem, the Palma Boys Social Club. Obviously, we could see Salerno with the hat and chomped cigar, as well as other members of the Genovese crime family. Cafaro is seen standing with his hands behind his back. Now, Vincent Cafaro did not just deal with numbers and gambling. He was also very involved in construction unions. Now, I want to relate to a show we just did on the father, Louis Gigante, that could be seen here. I talked about the fact that Louis Gigante was very involved with construction projects, and he worked with Vincent DiNapoli. It is also very well known that Vincent Cafaro worked directly with Vincent DiNapoli. Now, DiNapoli obviously was involved with drywall, and I'm going to talk about some of the situations that Cafaro would find himself in with not only DiNapoli, but other members. He would also say, Cafaro, that he would regularly, alongside Louis Muscatiello, who was a big-time Genovese construction magnate as well, that they would take payments weekly to Fat Tony Salerno at the Palma Boys Social Club. Now, I also want to talk about the fact that at one point in the early 80s, Vincent DiNapoli would go to Vincent the Fish Cafaro about an individual that he was a little worried about. In approximately 1981, Vincent DiNapoli and other members of the Genovese crime family were indicted for crimes relating to unions. At one point, also indicted in that indictment was an individual called Teddy Maritis. Now, Mr. Maritis was the head of the Carpenters Union, which the Genovese crime family was involved in. DiNapoli would, according to Cafaro, tell him, quote, he was worried that Maritis might cooperate with law enforcement when he was arrested, and that he was seeking approval to kill Maritis. Cafaro would say that he, quote, told DiNapoli, instead of talking to me, he should go to Saverio Sammy Black Santora, who was involved as well in the Mafia, and he could give the okay to do that. Now, shortly after the conversation, Cafaro would then say Mr. Maritis disappeared. Now, we don't know what happened to Mr. Maritis ultimately, but he never popped up again. So it is probable that Vincent DiNapoli did indeed go to Saverio Semi-Black Santora, who was a cop of regime, and got his blessing to take out Maritis. The truth of the matter was, if you were involved with the Mafia as a union official and you were allegedly cooperating, you were going to be killed. They weren't going to just question it. If they thought you would, they just got rid of you. It was a lot easier. Now, Vincent Cafaro was also readily involved with other unions and was very integral in creating construction at the Jacob Javits Convention Center. He would also say at one point that he basically ran different union jobs and had control of jobs inside the Javits Center. He said alongside him and Colombo heavyweight Vincent Jimmy Angelino, seen here with Jerry Langella. Angelino is on the left with the hat. He would say they both controlled essentially 25,000 jobs. So keep in mind, the Javits Center is completely mob run. They can do kickbacks. They're involved with no-show jobs. They can essentially do whatever they want at these large-scale construction operations. This is what would turn the Genovese crime family and people like Tony Salerno into extremely rich and powerful individuals. And it would make the Genovese crime family the foremost authority as far as criminal organizations in this country in the early 80s. And I also want to talk about the fact of a very interesting point. Now, as I said at the beginning, Vincent Cafaro would ultimately cooperate. I'm going to get to some of his cooperation here in a bit. It is important to understand that the federal government would say that Vincent Cafaro was not a particularly good FBI informant. In fact, he would wear a wire for about 6 months. But one thing and one person he would put them on the radar for was this individual, Laborio Barney Bellomo, who, according to the FBI, is the current head of the Genovese crime family. The feds would essentially say that in the 80s, when Cafaro cooperated, they had no idea who Bellomo was. They would come to find out about Bellomo through Vincent the Fish Cafaro, who sponsored him into the Genovese crime family. As we know, in the early 20s of Barney Bellomo, who'd become a made member at 20 in the Genovese crime family, and that was really a favor back to his father, Salvatore, who was a member of the family. He would ultimately die, and he would get the okay from Cafaro and Salerno that they would take care of his young son, Barney. Now, Barney would ultimately become a prodigy and is now very powerful in the Mafia, allegedly. We're not going to say that he is because, in the end, he is a convicted mobster, but I try to stay atypical in here. I don't try to go too deep. But Cafaro, again, would put Mr. Bellomo on the wavelengths of the FBI. By this point, Vincent Cafaro's son, Thomas Cafaro, is involved with the life as well. And I'm going to talk about some of his behavior. He was very close with Barney Bellomo. I want to get to the point where Vincent Cafaro decides that he wants to cooperate. Cafaro would be indicted in 1986 alongside several other members, including his son Thomas and Tony Salerno. Vincent Cafaro would several months later decide to cooperate. I want to read some of the things that were coming out of the wiretap in this case in general, involving not only Cafaro, but his son Thomas. According to a 1984 wiretap, Cafaro and his son would get involved with a conversation involving an individual called Crazy Tom. Thomas Cafaro would explain that the associate Crazy Tom was asking another person for $2,500 owed to him. When Cafaro states that Crazy Tom started yelling at the kid, Vincent Cafaro interjected and said, quote, "Why didn't he give him a fucking beating?" Later in the conversation, Cafaro, referring to the debt, says that to collect the money, he should tell him, quote, "I will break your fucking ass. Give me my money. If you ain't got my money in a week, I'm going to break your fucking head. That's all." He later tells his son that he, quote, "better tell Crazy Tom that his fellow better not come by the club because he would not have to get Crazy Tom to break the fucking kid's head." Vincent Cafaro would also speak to an associate in 1984 about a debt owed to him by someone else. An individual would say to Cafaro, quote, "I was going to give him a fucking beating like when Richie was here. If I had him, I'm going to break his motherfucking legs." Later in a conversation, Cafaro would relate, quote, "I had an incident with him going down there, threatening to fucking knock his fucking brains out. We got to prove it. I threatened to get the money." And then he would just go into another conversation about another mobster. So while Cafaro was a moneymaker, he was also someone that was engaging in not only assaults, but conspiracies and different frauds. The truth of the matter was Vincent Cafaro saw the writing on the wall, but he would also state that there was a different reason he decided to cooperate. He would state that in his cooperation that at one point he had a slot machine business, allegedly with Tony Salerno, but Cafaro would state that it was his business. And at one point he decided that he wasn't going to kick up anymore to Tony Salerno. This was his business. He wasn't going to kick up anymore. Cafaro would state that he told Salerno that, and that Salerno responded that, "No, it's my business." Cafaro would say, "No, it's not your business. It's mine. I created it." Salerno would respond, quote, "Then I'll pick up this cane and I'll hit you with it." Cafaro would allegedly respond, quote, "Well, that's the biggest mistake you'll make in your life. And if you pick up that cane to me, this is how it's going to turn out." Cafaro would exclaim that was when he decided to cooperate. I guess he kind of realized that even though he had put in 25 plus years with this individual and Tony Salerno, he still didn't respect Cafaro. And whether that was why he cooperated, we'll never really know. It could have just been that he didn't want to go to prison. As I said, the FBI would ultimately say that Vincent Cafaro really wasn't a great witness and that no one really went to jail for his cooperation. However, people like Barney Bellomo were put on the radar. If the truth of the matter was, it doesn't matter if you put people in prison for your cooperation, you are still talking about the mafia, which again is a blatant violation of the code that Vincent Cafaro took in the 70s. We remember that according to Fonzie Thierry, it is a blatant rule to talk about this thing to anyone but other Amico Nostra. The last time I checked, the FBI are not Amico Nostra. Ultimately, for Vincent Cafaro, from what I understand, he would move to North Carolina where he would die in 2004. Now, he would, as I said, speak to not only the FBI, but he would also speak to the Senate in 1988. His son, Thomas Cafaro, would stand tall, though. In that case he was arrested for in 1986, he decided he was going to stay loyal to the mafia. And at one point, it was alleged that Thomas Cafaro allegedly said that he would have no problem killing his father if that's what the mafia needed. Now, his lawyer would say that that was complete nonsense, but it is important to understand. Now, ultimately, members of the mafia, including people like Barney Bellomo, would forgive the young Cafaro, who they felt was respectable and they could still deal with. Generally, though, they probably shouldn't have dealt with Mr. Cafaro because his father was a rat. Though it is unknown today what Thomas Cafaro and is if he's still involved with the mafia. The last time I checked, he was living in Boca Raton, Florida. I would also find that according to different licensure services, Thomas Cafaro is a practicing insurance salesman. Now, whether or not he still does that, I don't know, nor did I look into deep that, but he is a licensed insurance agent in Florida, and that can be really researched by anyone. Ultimately, as we know, Tony Salerno would go away for 100 plus years and would die in federal prison. As I said earlier, Cafaro would die in 2004. Did he offer a ton to the FBI? No. But one thing we can say about Cafaro's testimony, it is very interesting. We would learn a lot about people like Tony Salerno, um, DiNapoli, Moschettiello, Chin, all these different people. And it really gave us a look into the mafia, the making ceremonies, all that sort of thing. It is very interesting nonetheless. Vincent Cafaro won't necessarily be remembered, but the truth of the matter was he was really the day-to-day second in command to Tony Salerno. Really, since his teenage years, Salerno respected Cafaro, and in the end, Cafaro betrayed him. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit that like button and make sure you subscribe. Also, as the ticker states below, go check out my podcast, The Sitdown, a crime history podcast presented by Barstool Sports. We actually did a full show on Tony Salerno. To me, it's way too long to just put on YouTube, but I urge you, go check it out and check out all our other great podcasts every week. I will tell you now, in the coming weeks, I have a gigantic guest. And when I say gigantic, I truly mean it. We'll see you next week here on The Sit Down.